For those of you who haven't joined our Gnostic studies before, I did want to like show you this book, the Nag Hammadi scriptures, this edition. Got all the different books that we've been talking about. It has the Gospel of Thomas, and it has the Gospel of Philip, which we're talking about today. It has the Gospel of Mary, which we have talked about before. This is like one of the best translations of all of the different documents that were found in the Nag Hammadi find. And so that's why it's called the Nag Hammadi scriptures, because it was found in Nag Hammadi, Egypt in 1945. And so all of these texts had been hidden until that time, and that was good because otherwise they would not have survived for us to study it. As you can tell, since they only found these texts in 1945, it's still a new thing. And as Leslie mentioned, there were some of them didn't survive because the people who found them were just farm people, you know, just on the land, and they actually burned some of them in the fire because they didn't know what they had. And so then there was this whole thing about someone realized what they had, and so then there was a thing about, well, we need to get money for it. We don't want it taken out of Egypt, you know, because of colonialism and the way that things of antiquity seem to be claimed by different people can be problematic. So there's a whole saga to these texts, in addition to the fact that early church fathers were against the Gnostics because they had some very diverging viewpoints from Orthodox Christianity.
Mildly.
So that's a general overview just for the people who are new and just coming into the discussion, and a review for those of you who have been here.
So hello, everybody. Glad to see all of you. Today, we're going to talk about the Gospel of Philip. First, I want to note that it is not a gospel, even though it's called that. It is actually a collection of, well, I don't even want to say sayings. From everything I read, and I'm going to give you some of the options that the scholars say, I liken it much more to one of my journals, where sometimes I'm thinking about a thought, and I write it down. And sometimes I see something about the thought from somebody else and I write it down. And then I have a different thought and I write it down. Now, the beauty of this new notion of bullet journals, I would likely go back, number all my pages, and at least I would say all my thoughts about Mary appear on page 1, 7, 12, and 14. I see, Shelby, you know what I'm talking about. Bullet journal, God bless them. But whoever compiled thing that they now call the Gospel of Philip apparently didn't know that trick, and so what we have is a collection of writings which may have been the author's thinking, but we do believe in some sense they took them from other writings. That's where you get the Valentinian notion that maybe it was some of what the theologian Valentine had been thinking. And there are some things that are also in the canonical Gospels. And there's just some things that seem to resonate some of the themes we've seen in the Gospel or Book of Thomas, and we've seen in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. So it's a compilation, I think would be the easiest way to say it, rather than somebody who wrote down to write a consistent theological perspective. Now, just before we got on here, I found an article by Elaine Pagels that she's come to the view over the course of the 50 years that this author has a particular perspective, but without reading it, and it's sort of like what you all are beginning to touch on before we began, it'd be like Ellen has a particular perspective, because I'm choosing particular things to focus on and particular writings to record for future reference. So in that sense, there is going to be a perspective. It would reflect the author's interests. It would reflect the author's speculations and concerns. It is not a gospel because it is neither narrative, nor does it seem to proclaim the good news as we understand a gospel to proclaim the good news. And I think, based on what I've read, that all scholars would agree that it was whoever translated the Gospel of Philip from the Greek is the one who put at the end Gospel of Philip. So it's not a very scholarly attribution to say Philip. From what I've read, little I've read, they can't even say that it is based on a group of people who followed the original apostle Philip. So until I do a little more study on that, I think we have to be careful about attributing this to some group of people who follow Philip. Let me read you some of the things that people have written. I gave you the modern version of what they've written, but some think of it as an anthology of items. Some have called it a disorganized collection of diverse materials. Some have said, and I didn't notice it myself, but there is some sort of repetition of catchwords that connect sentences. I think the bullet journal version of things, connecting things, would have been a lot better. Some call it just proceeding by free association and leading from one theme to the other. That would sound like our Bible study discussions, right? Some think it might be a collection of excerpts from a Christian Gnostic catechism, but they have been not inserted in a narrative framework. And some suggest there might be some sort of coherence in an underlying symbolic system. See, this is how scholars use fancy words to say what I said, which is somebody wrote down a bunch of stuff in different times and different places, and then we found it, right? So I'm not trying to dismiss this writing as unimportant. I'm just suggesting that I appreciate how scholars use fancy words for what is, some believe, a rather disorganized collection of items, from which we will try to have some meaning, gain some resonance. So what are the themes that are seen in the Gospel of Philip? Now, before I get to the themes, I'll remind you, as you all were talking before, this is one of the texts found in the overall collection of texts that were only found, 45, 50 years ago. This text is believed to have been originally in Greek, but has been found in the Coptic language. Now, no one tells me quite what that means for translation purposes, or what it means for our understanding of the text. The same way, having had the Bible for so long, people can go, when it got translated from here to here, here's what happened. We don't know. But I think it indicates more what community may have been using the text. So this text was preserved by a community that spoke a Coptic language and knew Syriac as an alphabet or a tool of writing. So we know it was informing that community, and we know these other writings we've been studying, because they're in the same language and found in the same place, were also influencing this particular regional community. What we know, and we talked about early on when we began the study of the Gnostic text, which are not necessarily Gnostic in a heretical sense, is that they were hidden because these texts appear to be considered dangerous to what was becoming a more established Christian community. Dangerous either because they undercut what bishops were claiming Jesus was about, maybe dangerous because they were focusing on subjects that the established by then Christian community didn't want to deal with. I'm saying all this to give you a framework for reading the texts. So when we begin our study, even in more earnest in January, and we will begin to have 2 Bible studies a month, probably at a different time, you'll have some way of thinking about what you're reading. One of the major themes is this continuation of the theme that what is spirit, what is earthly, what is considered living, what is dead to us, what is the nature of the spirit, what does it mean to be alive in Christ. But Philip introduces it, we'll call it Philip. Philip introduces it using some different metaphors and language. One theme that runs through this is the theme of marriage or marital union. But again, he uses this metaphor, but it seems to address what we saw in Thomas and in Mary. How do we connect two different spirits, male and female, so that we have this new human being? But this text approaches it in a different fashion, with this image of marriage as the way to do it. The scholarship suggests that marriage is a representation of a mixture of the female and the male spirit, right? Remember how we had trouble with the prior two texts, how they were representing male and female? This has the same type of wrestling in it. Here the introduction says is one of the major themes is the reunification of the soul and spirit in a heavenly union that realizes the identification of the soul with its true self. So what is the true self versus the self that appears to our eyes, right? And early on, and I'll try to read it, one of the passages is about Jesus appears to those who are great to be great, to those who are humble to be humble, to those who are X to be X. I've always kind of thought of Jesus like that, you know, Jesus can reflect, Jesus, if he comes to earth in a earthly body, is reflecting some part of divinity, right? It's not the whole of divinity. So it makes sense to me that people can see different things in the being of Jesus than other people see, and can, where's Thaddeus, project upon that divinity or on Jesus what they want to see of Jesus, the same way we talk about the projection of our wishes onto other persons, or even worse, the projection of our weaknesses and accuse the other of that same weakness. Here they say that the myth of Sophia and her eagerness to rejoin her spiritual companion, the Logos, may have been very present in the mind of whoever wrote this. So Sophia is a female spirit, wisdom in the Older Testament, and Logos we know to be, Logos is used in John, the word made flesh. So that's another theme I'm just reading through. And then they talk about androgyny here in the introduction to Philip. If the worldly metaphor of marriage produces the idea of heavenly spiritual sexuality, this concept is completely modified in the mystical union of androgyny. Androgynous union repairs the damage of the separation of male and female, which occurred when the female element fell into matter, according to the myth of Sophia. So there's a lot of this speculation again about what's real, what isn't real, what's male, what's female, what is a proper union of these spirits, what is an improper union, what is dead to us, what is alive to us. The final thing, and I did find one or two scholarly articles on it, is there seems to be a lot of what one might call sacramental theology in Philip, which is the notion of what is baptism, what is marriage. Here they say the master did everything in a mystery: baptism, chrism, Eucharist, redemption, and the bridal chamber. The sacrament of the bridal chamber has been the object of various interpretations since the time of the church fathers. Does it only have symbolic and spiritual value, or was it actually acted out in Gnostic groups? This book ends with the metaphor of the bridal chamber, which is an interesting way to end a gospel, and far different from anything that we have read, even in the Gnostic text. The other distinction I would make, certainly in this text from the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, is Mary Magdalene's gospel, at least the parts that we have, seems to put words, we know who's speaking what, so it's clear to us where the ideas are coming from, or at least attributed to. So first Jesus is speaking, and we go through the part where Jesus speaks till he disappears. And then Peter specifically asks Mary to talk. Mary Magdalene talks. Then Peter and a number of others have issue with it. And then Levi leads us to the end of the gospel. So we have, it's a conversation that's going on in that. Thomas seems to be very much a gospel of sayings. They're all sayings. This, again, is a mixture of things, far different from the other two writings. Anything to add to that, Amy, for an introduction to the writings?
Nope, I think that was really good. It does kind of go in some interesting directions that are both familiar and unfamiliar to the Mary and Thomas texts. And one of the things I found interesting that was not in the scholarly literature, but one of the things I found on YouTube was actually a Hindi man who analyzed the Gospel of Philip, or the book of Philip, the text of Philip, through the Hindi religion. And he kind of tied it to, when they talk about, there's a lot of what Ellen mentioned in the beginning about, there's a lot of talk of soul versus flesh, and what is the true flesh, and what is, like, there's a heavenly flesh and then there's an earthly flesh. But they talked about it in terms of kind of reincarnation in this Hindi person's interpretation of the gospel, kind of how you go through these different fleshes on earth, kind of until you figure it out and reach nirvana. And so I thought that that was a really interesting way, you know, because I've told you all before, I look at things in different levels, but to look at it from like Christian scholars, but then be able to look at it through Hindi scholars as well. I thought that was very interesting. And it does show similarities in the same way that I saw similarities with Mary Magdalene and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So that goes back to a lot of what we've talked about, is how we think we're globalized now, and that all of our ideas kind of mesh together now because we're more connected with the internet. But they had a trail of trade that crossed continents. And so there was probably far more influence between the different religious traditions than we like to give them credit for.
I think, and I'll admit my bias, which I sort of have so far, is when we get into this more mystical type of text, clearly this is a mystical community that's focused on spirit. Mm-hmm. Remember my own context, which is I was a lawyer first, and we dealt in very concrete things. Everything we had to have facts. We had to know where it took place, when it took place, who participated in it. Not that I don't have a mystical being. And then I would say that Catholic mysticism is different from this mysticism in the sense that it's very mysterious, but it doesn't really come out in sayings like this. It doesn't sound the same. And I'll look into that more. So I am confounded sometimes by reading the Gnostic text, but it is also, which I think is the reason Pastor Amy's having us do this, it challenges us to know and to be open to how other people thought about Jesus, right? And how other people thought about the early Christian community, because we don't get this perspective. And I think it is probably more akin to Asian, Eastern spirituality. The language to me is language that I have a hard time grasping onto, but I'm telling you why. But I'm also very much convinced that in order to understand the full scope of the early Jesus followers, we have to understand what they all were thinking and be open to it. It helps us practice being open to other people in the current times.
One of the things that I heard from a non-scholarly source too that I thought was really interesting was just about how it seems to be that the point of this text, in addition to it just being a collection of notes, kind of exactly how Ellen was describing it, was that some of the power that it has is in just meditating on the words. And this, you know, this is something we've talked about as different ways to read things. This would be one of the ways. Mm-hmm. And that the more we just kind of read it and sit with it and pray on it, that was the person's advice, was that you find the deeper knowledge. And that was a lot of the type of mysticism that Gnostics were, in the way that Ellen was describing. It was more of an Eastern way than rather a Catholic mystic way. And so I just think it's fascinating that it's a relatively new text from an old time, and it has all these potentially different sort of religious interpretations applied to it. And it's so much longer than the ones that we've studied so far. So it has a lot of good space to really explore, I think. I think I cut Benita off.
Well, one of the things as I was listening to Ellen talk, there is the Catholic Church seems to have caught some more of that Eastern, brought it into the Western Church. And one of the problems that I constantly work with for myself, I'm not saying the church has it, it's almost like sometimes when I run into disciples that they deny their spiritual aspects until you really get to know them, or, I mean, it's not talked about that much. We have a definition and this kind of thing, and then you run into a Lutheran or a Baptist, or, and you have kind of a different expression. So we have that same long-term thing, and which is so helpful for me to have these Gospels aspects that, I brush. Well, we've only had these for 70 years. I'd say 100 years ago. But, I do think that's an important aspect of why I'm really interested in listening.
Go ahead, Leslie.
I'm wondering how much of this may have roots in, again, the ancient Egyptian ways of thinking. What people don't realize is that a lot of the Greek mathematics actually has its roots in Egypt. Pythagoras studied in Egypt. And of course, this is going to be that I'm smelling racism all over the place now. But obviously, as it has been passed down to us, we think of the Greeks as inventing the Pythagorean theorem, when indeed the Egyptians did, and Pythagoras recorded it. So what's happened is we have recorded our history and history of mathematics rooting back to the Greeks, when that's not where it came from, which is, we don't want people to think that something could have come out of Africa that was, a lot of the Greek mathematics is rooted in the ancient Egyptian. The Greeks took it further, but I have a friend who studies like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and I haven't read any of her material. I need to, but I've heard some of her talks. And there's a lot of thinking in the ancient Egyptians that, she translates hieroglyphics. She's an Egyptologist. But there's a lot of thinking about the spirit in the ancient Egyptian. And of course, these people were in that part of the world, and we don't know how much of that got handed down to them just in living, if you know what I mean. Just, you have traditions that come down in certain areas. So that's just a question that I have. I wonder where the roots, if there could be roots in that also.
I mean, I definitely think there could be, especially if it was translated into Coptic. I mean, that, like we said, the trade was all through there. So if Eastern, like much further away, would have influence, I'm sure that Egypt also.
Even thousands, pre-Moses, the Egyptians had a lot of thinking about spirituality that was much more ancient. And so people in that part of the world may also sort of have absorbed that sort of thinking that just kind of got handed down, because these were in Egypt. So I don't know. I haven't read it.
Wait, I think Ellen may have had this, professor may not have, but Marty Stussy at CTS.
Oh, yeah.
Is Hebrew Bible, which is what, Christians call Old Testament. And she was very clear that ancient Near Eastern religions all borrowed off of each other. There's nothing new. It all gets recycled and reinterpreted, and our new contexts added to it, but that religion does not ever really throw anything away. And so what happens as people mix in different ways, cross paths through economic means or whatever other means, they learn from each other, and certain things kind of just get added to it, taken away, and evolve over time. So yeah, there's no telling how many different things were influencing.
To Leslie's point, it would be interesting to explore the Book of the Dead, because it was, although it wasn't codified, so you don't really find the same version of it in each instance, but it is a judgment. It's an afterlife. They believed in the afterlife. There's a judgment when you die. There is eternity. So you raise a really interesting point, Leslie. That'd be kind of fun to explore that book at some point, maybe.
And that sort of thing is not nearly as well developed in the Hebrew scriptures. I mean, the Jews weren't thinking of that nearly to the extent of as other peoples were.
Yeah, but what Professor Stussy, and I'm sure she had Amy do it too, before we ever read the Old Testament, we had to read the older Mesopotamian tales. Mm-hmm. And although there's some who claim they can't find the complete link, to suggest that the ancient Israelites were not influenced by that out of Babylonian we would be mistaken. So she did. So I thought we'll try to read some of the passages. I do want to get through sowing and reaping to honor Thaddeus. I will start. A Hebrew makes a Hebrew, and such a person is called a convert. A convert does not make a convert. Some people are as they are and make others like them, while others simply are. Confucius says, interesting way to start the sayings. It looks like some may be missing before this by the way they number it. So now they're already talking about what makes what. A plus B equals what?
C.
Yeah. But B plus A plus B, A plus A Hebrew makes a convert, which would be B, but a B plus a B does not make a convert. So the puzzle begins. Inheriting the living and the dead. A slave seeks only to be free and does not seek the master's estate. For a child, it is not enough to be a child, but a child claims the father's inheritance. Heirs to the dead are dead, and what they inherit is dead. Heirs to the living are alive, and they inherit both the living and the dead. The dead inherit nothing, for how could a dead person inherit? But if a dead person inherits the living will not die, and the dead will come to life. Although this reminds me of portions of the Apostles' Creed. God, he will come for the living and the dead, and he will raise up the dead to life, right? Boy, Jody, you'll have to look it up for me. My Catholic memory escapes me for a moment. But a lot of Catholic liturgy talks about the living and the dead. And I think what we're getting at here is similar to what we heard in Thomas particularly, is what does it mean to be alive in Christ? I'm adding some stuff. What does it mean to be dead? And what perspective do we have to have in order to be spiritually alive? I think that's what we're getting at. Jesus, Gentiles, and Christians. A Gentile does not die, never having been alive so as to die. One who has believed in truth is alive, but this person is at risk of dying just by being alive. Jesus died to come alive, maybe something like that. Since Christ came, the world has been created. Cities have been beautified and the dead have been buried. When we were Hebrews, we were orphans with only a mother. But when we became Christians, we had a father and a mother. And apparently this is also reflected in the Gospel of Thomas. Sowing and reaping. Our gardeners along here will like this. And so are community gardeners. So whoever sows in winter reaps in summer. Winter is the world. Summer is the other eon, the eternal realm. Let's sow in the world to reap in summer. And for this reason, we should not pray in winter. From winter comes summer. If someone reaps in winter, the person will not really reap, but will pull out the young plants, and such do not produce a crop. That person's field is barren, not only now, but also on the Sabbath. So it sounds like we're talking about the maturing of the Christian spirit. here is if someone reaps in winter, the person out will not really reap, but will pull out the young plants, and such do not produce a crop. Sounds like a lot of parables that Jesus had. Throwing seeds, right? Did it fall on fallow ground? Did it fall in the weeds? How long do we let it sow?
It's pulling out the immature plants before you get something to harvest.
What's that?
It's about pulling up the immature plants before they mature enough to bear fruit.
And I think that's the question that a lot of Gnostic Gospels are touching on. How do we reach spiritual maturity? What was the one? Was it Mary's or Thomas's? The as you were saying earlier, Amy, that there are the things we see, and then there's the things that are hidden from us. Right. And so Mary started to talk to the disciples, Mary Magdalene, in her gospel, about the things that were hidden from us. This notion that we have to study for a period of time before it will be revealed to us, which is also very much part of a lot of Eastern religions, right? The stages we have to go through to reach nirvana, the stages we have to go through before we can truly be wise.
Both in Mary Magdalene and in some interpretations I've read about this, they're talking about not only reaching the spiritual maturity and wisdom. That's kind of what they're saying is when you wait until summer to reap, you get that knowledge while you're still on earth, and it helps you in the next spiritual realm. Whereas if you reap too early and kind of just put your values in your limited understanding of the earth, then now I'm bringing in the Hindu thing, then you have to go through the earth again. Like you have to be reincarnated. You don't get to go to nirvana or to the heavenly beings with Christ. Use your time well on earth, but the goal is to be you just fully in your spirit self. And that's kind of a very Gnostic thing, choosing spirit over flesh. So that spirit flesh, it has various definitions with different Gnostics, but that's a very kind of universal topic that they have in the Gnostic text, is distinguishing between physical reality and spiritual reality.
I'm just going to skip over Christ came to light and darkness, and then we'll have whatever discussions we want, just because, again, this is about the what is what. Light and darkness, life and death, and right and left are siblings of one another and inseparable. For this reason, the good are not good, the bad are not bad, life is not life, and death is not death. Each will dissolve into its original nature, but what is superior to the world cannot be dissolved, for it is eternal, right? So it's these dualistic concepts. One is light is not just light. It has to be understood in terms of the darkness. Life is not understood except for as in contrasted with death. They're siblings, and they're concepts that are understood in relation to each other, as opposed to, we often say we would not understand joy if we did not have pain. So I think it's the same idea. Okay. I'm opening it up for a free-for-all because we're heading on 6 o'clock. And go ahead, Leslie, you were going to say something earlier.
I've been treating myself to Paula Gooder's sermons this week because I've been doing some cleaning and such. And she did a scathing indictment of the Anglican Church about people not wanting to learn, that people get in the church, they get in the church, they just want to go through the motions and do what they've always done and felt good, but they don't want to learn more. And if you're not learning, my gosh, how depressing, but again, this is, you need to keep living and you need to keep learning. Even though she's 94, she's still learning. But I'm just saying that this was the importance of continuing to learn, continuing to explore, is so important, and that's the thing that is just killing the church, and particularly mainline Protestants.
Shelby, had you unmuted yourself at one point?
Yeah, I was just going to add to what was being said earlier about cycles. I really thought of the old adage, you reap what you sow. And then I brought that back to the idea of karmic bonds in Hinduism, and the achievement of moksha is like a parallel to nirvana and even to salvation, the breaking of those bonds that hold us to the earth and our earthly selves, if you want to do that dualistic thought.
Yeah.
And again, like going through cycles of rebirth, and sometimes you have to wait. Sometimes you just have to wait it out and tend to it, and then the time will come for you to reap.
Right. And Meredith has kindly put up in the chat, this is the language I was thinking of in the Apostles' Creed. Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended to the dead. On the third day, he rose again. He ascended into heaven, seated at the right hand of the Father, and will come again to judge the living and the dead. So they are doing a riff. Even the mainstream church, we'll call it mainstream for lack of a better word, was riffing on what it meant for Jesus's relationship to the living and to the dead, and what is our relationship to it. Now, there's many different theories about it, but clearly it sounds a little bit like it's outside the realm, but it's embedded. This language is repeated in even what we would call mainstream considerations. So much so that it's embodied in the Apostles' Creed. Thank you, Meredith. Good job.
Right. But yeah, Shelby, I like the use of the word bonds. You have stuff to gain and learn in this life, but it's your temporary condition. So you could say that living is your temporary condition, but being in your ethereal soul form is your permanent condition. One thing that I wanted to refer to with Bonita as well, like what you were saying about the disciples, and Ellen earlier about your legal mind. I think that in our culture is one thing that it's easy for us to dismiss is mystical and spirit. Because even as a pastor, like Ellen and I are both pastors, and Bonita, you're a chaplain, and we all, and Shelby is now done with seminary. Woo!
Whoa!
I was going to save that for the end, but I'll throw it in now here. So we'll celebrate you in a minute. But the thing is that we learn is that there are so many questions. And so it's just one of those things where it's not cut and dry. And, to stick to certain traditions, we have to start to question the power moves behind some of those things. Because if these texts were hidden for so long, it suggests that there is value. If it had enough value that it had to be hidden to survive for so long. And I think Jill was one who made that point very early in our discussions. And I think the fact that we shy away from the mystical and the spiritual and like demons and angels and all of that stuff, I was raised evangelical, so I got too much of that. And so then I flipped back to the intellectual side. But now that I'm kind of like balancing myself between the two, I'm kind of seeing that there's a lot of spiritual stuff that we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss. Even though it's scary and it's like it taxes our intellectual mind and our traditions that we were completely raised in, I think we are meant to learn and grow, as Leslie was talking about. Like, I think this is part of our journey, and God, as my grandmother said, gave us a brain, so God is not going to punish us for using it. And
I've never heard that. I love it.
Because my grandma said it to me, because I was always a questioner, so I would get into so much trouble. That's why I'm the type of preacher that I am, y'all, because I asked the questions from the time I was like old enough to talk. Well, why do some people go to hell if God is love? And let me just tell you, when you're like 3 to 5 years old asking adults that question, they're just like, it leads to depression. And so I think it's okay for us to struggle with these questions and to not think that just because it's different from what we've been raised with, that it's bad. I mean, we all have to kind of go through the journey for knowledge. And that's why I think I personally was so attracted to the Gnostics, because they're seekers, and I think we're all seekers in this space. And so, for me, it's not about debunking anything. It's just about exploring and seeing if there's other connections that can be made that are beyond our current existence.
I'm raising my hand.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I was shaking my head up and down, yes, when Leslie was talking, when earlier about the Egyptians. I did a 4-year study with the Episcopalians out of Sewanee, University of the South, St. Luke's Seminary. And we struggled with the Egyptian concept of one God and how much argument and downright people losing their life over whether there was one God or not. And I thought, yeah, Leslie's exactly right. And I think we're still, if we look at all of these other concepts, we see that as human beings, we have always sought some kind of a power greater than our own, or a relationship equality or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I'm laughing at Meredith and y'all about the creed, because there were people that lost their heads over, literally, over the Athanasian Creed. So, I think this is so exciting to me to see that again, that the ancients and the early Christians were divided in the good sense of that word. There were different strands of scholarship, and that the mystics have some background, because I was born in the 1940s early, and I can tell you, mystics were not well thought of in the Protestant church growing up either. So
that's a big problem, that people don't know the Bible.
Right, because they wouldn't fall for bad theology as easily if they had actually read it for themselves.
Well, yeah. they were kept from reading it for so many centuries, because they put it in languages that they couldn't. But no, it is a problem. And when so I'm working on a sermon for this month, which will be about Mary. So much of who Mary is, and just got, I kind of laughed to myself. So I'm reading over the Magnificat and the Visit with Elizabeth and Magnificat. And to think that the critical theological question of all that takes place is whether it really was John in Elizabeth's womb who left, and all that. So we're going to have a whole dose on Mary in 2 weeks. I just say that because it's the same idea that.
Oh yeah.
I so agree with you, Leslie, that it's not only just about reading; it's emphasis. What are we directed to read? Right. The lectionary directs us to read certain things, which then cause pastors to preach about certain things.
And leave out certain things.
And to leave out certain things, yeah.
And then that's gotten so ingrained in our culture that I will tell you that from what I hear from other pastors is that then it's so ingrained in the culture, even if the pastors want to diverge from that message, they cannot, because their congregations will burn them at the stake, figuratively, or they lose their job.
Literally.
So there's a tie of pastors to capitalism and income that further.
That was quite the leap there, Amy.
I'm always ready with that leap. Always.
That's not a leap. I mean, they do it for fear of their jobs.
They do. Absolutely. And so people will not speak the truth as they understand it because they're afraid. And we all have this in different professions, right? But pastors are included in that. And so, we have to so the point of all of these studies too is to liberate us, because God calls us to freedom. Freedom means freedom to be who we are called to be. And this text in particular, which we will get into, talks about how that we are enslaved in this world to these sorts of things. Like, you can't have a job if you don't have this idea. I mean, they're not like modern terms, but in the sense that to be truly free is to recognize that we, according to Gnostic thoughts, are created good by God. And that all of these religious traditions have told us that we are bad, and that is in order to control us to whoever is the power that be, whether it's this country, a past dynasty, empire, whoever, it doesn't matter, but the powers of this world. And, some of this is even that there is evil spirits who fuel the powers of this world, because the diamerge, they call it, like what we would consider Satan, feeds off the energy from the anger and the jealousy and the competition and the brokenness. So if you think about that in terms of Christian texts where they talk about we're fighting against powers and principalities, there is a mystical element in the traditional texts that weren't excluded too. It's also that we can know that God created us good and we are who we are, and everything else is just part of our learning journey, and we will continue to grow as we are open to it. So,
and one, I was only laughing because she didn't say it the way you did, Jill, that's tied to their job. She went straight to the word capitalism, which I love. But if we go back to our text, not to make us go back to our text.
Absolutely should go back to the text.
A slave seeks only to be free and does not seek the master's estate, which is what Amy was talking about, right? Yeah. That what we want is to stop being slaves to the world or to lack of knowledge or lack of access, or be a slave to the concrete material things, but to be free, right? To be free in our thought, in our soulfulness, in our expression of ourselves, and our expression of our love of Jesus and what we learned from that. So,
our godly connection.
Yes, thank you.
I would suggest that you take this knowledge, like the introduction that Ellen has brought, and kind of try and read these texts as you read them to prepare for next set of studies, just through the lens of becoming free in whatever sense that means to you.
Okay. And Shelby, who just went off air, shall we applaud her? Everybody hit the clap.
Yes, congratulations.
Yes, party. Yes.
Thank you.
Anything else, folks? And maybe anybody would like to pray us out, please remember to follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, but we have our service coming up in 2 weeks. And then starting in January, we're still compiling the results of the survey. We will be moving to a time on Sunday, but we will be having something every week, which was one of the requests of many people, so that we always remember to, oh, it's 6 o'clock on Sunday, Lab Church, here we are, right? The mobile pantry is in full action. You can help us by liking us on YouTube, by attending our various services, or making a little tiny contribution will go a long way. They handed out, 25 bags of food in an hour?
No, it was more like 36.
Anyone like to pray us out?
Let us pray. Creator God, we thank you for this time together, for our community, including and especially the cats. We thank you for the joy that they bring, and we thank you, God, for the joy that all of us bring to one another to this virtual space. We thank you for gifting us with brains and the power to use them, and we pray to discern your message through any way possible to live our truth and to be a force for good in the world. In your name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right, everybody.
3.5 years doing that.
I love it. Stay safe.